All right. The recording has started.
Okay. Welcome, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. Thank you for joining this webinar on the Global Governance course, online course. And thank you for the very long but very careful list of questions that you sent me and, from all the groups, which for me shows that you've been following the course pretty carefully, because the question actually, I can't remember a group is, I've done that for a few years with this basis of the course, a group with so many very carefully worded questions. So congratulations so far, and I've tried to answer some of them as much as I can, and then I select a few which actually cover more or less, lots of ground, and then I'm happy to follow up with more specific questions. Some are very specific, some are broader, so I try to focus on the broader that could actually be interest for the three groups. As always, you could add things on the chat, although I'm not going to focus so much on the chat. Maybe Lukasz can actually follow that and others, and we have a bit of time. I think the previous year we had only 1 hour, which was always kind of too short. We increased it by 15 minutes this year, so we have a bit more time, although not much. I'll try not to talk too much if possible, at least in the first round of questions. So out of the 30 more questions that I got, I select a few which I think are going to cover some of the concern or the question that you seem to have. And of course, this year's context, each year's context changes, but this year's context in terms of global governance and mechanism of sustainability, effectiveness, enforcement, big power politics, small states, I think everything is kind of somehow magnified since since the advent of the new US administration. So some of the things are really kind of high concern to many of you, but some of the things are not new. They have been ongoing for decades, simply being a bit magnified under the current situation. So I'll start with there's several questions that are connected to shifts in power dynamics, and basically what I understood as the essence of the concern that you have is, okay, if we have shifting power dynamics, how can global governance adjust to this, or how does governance kind of manage this kind of change of of power dynamics, and if possible, of giving you precedence and where how it has scoped. So of course, point number one is, I think, as I emphasize very strongly in the online course, the international governance, global governance, is nothing like
global,
national
la
governance.
gobernanza
Okay, there's
mundial no tiene
nothing
nada que
like
ver
a hierarchy
con la
that of
gobernancia
some kind of a
nacional,
government being with the
donde
head of the
Dans un
president or the prime
gouvernement avec
minister, and
le
even
président, le Premier
a
ministre
Supreme Court, a National
ou
Court, a Court of
la
Justice that would at some point, hey, this is the way it is, you respect the law, you don't. In some states it does not work as properly as it should, but a kind of hierarchy. International politics has never been that, with a few exceptions. I'll come back at the regional level, like the European Union, but even so, it's nothing like strict hierarchy. So in a system without strict hierarchy, you're always dependent on the goodwill of the more powerful. Okay, so that's from the very beginning. That's the way it was designed with veto power in UN Security Council, because if the big guys don't want the global governance mechanism, there won't be any global governance mechanism. So that's a constant. Now, of course, in order for that to work, these big guys have to agree on a few common, let's say, norms or principle, a minimal thing. If they don't, then global governance is just there for window dressing. But they did agree on a few things, particularly in peace, but also in economic integration. And I must say, for most of the and so up to maybe 10 years ago, it was a pretty strong consensus led by a coalition of states, Western European states and the US and the Western Hemisphere, Northern Western Hemisphere, on a few common principles. Okay, this group was, of course, in conflict with the Soviet Union bloc, but was never really part of that global governance up to the end of the 80s. It was, for make sure that we don't have war of aggression, but on all things, on technical issues, it was always a bit of a kind of in and out. Okay, and so for for a while, this was a global governance was quite, it was really not global. Then it became global at the end of the Cold War with the dismantlement of the Soviet Union and the communist world. It becomes really global, and it was still hanging a bit of this common willingness to have more or less open borders, repeating sovereignty and so forth. But they were never a situation where, and so the power change dynamics, the fact one of the big power disappeared, was relatively easy to cope with, because that means they disappeared, they left the space open to the other solution, which was global governance dominated by the West and the US in particular. We're now facing a situation that global governance, which is a very young mechanism, just less than a century, is facing a return to more multipolarity. And so we don't know how the system is going to cope with that, and we see those tensions. So this tension between the US and China, between US and Soviet Union, between some of the big emerging countries as Brazil and India and China, and maybe the US. And Europe is kind of somehow fading away in this picture. So you have a very multipolar system, which was pre-existing before we invented really global governance, meaning in the 19th century and beginning of 20th century, but not after we invented global governance with all these international organizations, meaning after World War II. So in terms of precedent for power dynamic shifting, as much as they have been shifting the last 10 years, I'm afraid we don't have any precedent. Okay, so because we never had before a global governance that it was designed. So global governance was designed after 1945, mostly in an era in which you have this understanding between the Soviet bloc and the Western liberal bloc that, okay, leave me alone in my bloc, and then split out the Soviet Union point, and then on the rest of the world, you can organize with global governance. But of course, there was a kind of, in fact, the Soviet Union never completely contested the UN. And so there was a kind of common understanding would work, with limitation, as we know, lots of civil war, proxy war between the Soviet Union and US in most, Latin America and Africa. But, at least there was a kind of minimal common understanding. Now, there's big questions because, of course, particularly due to Trump, to which extent this can acceptance that multilateral governance is still okay, is good, is up to us. So I think it's the issue and the challenge to which extent there will be a common normative basis for global governance between China, the US, Soviet Union, Europe, India, Brazil, and maybe the African continent represented by the African Union is a very open question. A lot of people, of course, in Geneva hope that they're going to stick to existing norms of multilateralism, meaning diffuse reciprocity, non-aggression, trying to respect, somehow sovereignty of others. But I think at that stage, it's a lot of hope. We're not sure how it's going to go. Okay, so really hard to answer that question of power dynamics. But of course, a system of rules which is so dependent on a few big actors is influenced by power dynamics. It would be, I think, it would be really myopic to really cannot see that, or an illusion. And so there's this interesting challenge for us as analysts to see to which extent they will be able to cope. I may come back to that. Linked to that, there is a few questions about, okay, if states make commitment, in particular to finance those mechanisms, how sustainable are those commitments? Okay, if you look at Trump, you say, yeah, it's sustainable in as long as Trump, or the U.S. administration in that case, under a given president, is not sure it would change under if Trump is no longer president and so on, a bit with the same profile. It depends on big power, basically, mood or priorities. This being said, so we see that they cut a bit of funding. There's no way who is going to force the US to pay its due to WHO or WTO. We're not going to send an army in US to say, okay, you have not paid your due. So in the end, it's up to those states. Now, this being said, you may notice that the US has very blunt, because I'm talking the US, but it may apply to other states, of course, that which is interesting as they still normally continue to pay, maybe not as much, and often with delay. But if you look at, for instance, the World Trade Organization, which clearly Trump does not really like very much, the US just paid it a year payment. So they're still paying. So because deep down, they still think it could be useful. So there is a bit of a discussion that we show you that we have the money. You better be nice to us, otherwise we cut your funding. But on the other hand, they're not yet ready to say this is useless. So you could say, at least in messaging and in politics, it's not sustainable. But so far, it remains relatively sustainable with cuts. Now, you could discuss whether the cuts are good or bad, but there is a common understanding among all analysts that all the money given to IO has not been used as efficiently as it could have been. So not that I'm necessarily a big fan of the methods of US administration, but you have to, if you have worked with the UN, some of you have worked in this organization, it's not the most efficient of the organization, maybe due to the size, to the way it works, the politics into it. Who is to blame for that? So in fact, sustainability may not be seen only from the fact of sustainability of commitment of states, but also sustainability of views or way to function the UN. Just to add to that, but of course it's up to states to decide. They don't want to pay. Okay, if you are Botswana or Lesotho and you don't pay, you're going to be in big trouble because some big guys are going to tell you, you better pay that, right? But if you're a big state and you say, well, I'm not going to pay for now, what's going to happen? You try to peer pressure and say, well, we should all pay, but that is really make it very iffy and very difficult for international organization to function. Now, still in this notion of power politics, it's global, as I say, power politics has always been there and is going, at least in the foreseeable future that I see, is going to remain there. Some states are simply more powerful than some others, and those states have a very hard time to accept to contribute proportionally to their power and their wealth to the global system. But if you take a domestic level, this is the same discussion we have had at domestic level between the people that are billionaires and the people that are not. The billionaires don't want to pay as much as they should, given the difference of wealth between, let's say, you and you, me, and these guys, because they think it's they can evade it. So it's to some extent it's been the same thing at the international level. There's kind of a disproportionate, basically, if you want, kind of contribution that they want to make to that, and that's life, and if we want these states to participate, we have to give them some guarantee that if they pay more, they want more power. So it's like at a domestic level, you would like your billionaire, your own country, to pay way more taxes. They would say, okay, fine, but I have to have more political power than you and me. Okay, that does not happen in domestic politics, right? So let's say I take, at least in terms of vote, Elon Musk has still one vote, formally, de jure, okay? But he could say, I'm going to pay way more, taxpayer money than anyone working in the US, but I want to have 10,000 votes, 100,000 votes in the US presidential election. Okay. And so in international politics, we are somehow in that situation where, of course, the US, for instance, China, and EU, Brazil, they all pay more in terms of contribution, but they have more power. At least, the one that veto power have way more power. In the IMF and the World Bank, they pay way more to the World Bank and the IMF, but they have way more votes. Okay. So that's the way it works. It is the price to pay for having these people on board. Now, is it too big a price or not? That's a question that we may have, right? So to which extent the people that pay more proportionally have more power? So is it really a proportion of your contribution, or is it simply one country, one vote? And these are the two systems, right? And all the regional banks or the global banks function like, okay, it's like a company. I have more shares in the company, I have more votes on the board. That's a business, sector. In politics, we tend to think that, like in the federal system, let's say, like in Switzerland, all the cantons should have the same weight to some extent when they vote on some issues. Okay, but in international relations, it's really still very much power politics. At some point, you really have to accept that some have more influence than some others, and if they don't, they're going to use other ways to have more influence. Let's go to the visible and invisible. It's linked to, and so I think there's a question: is the veto power still relevant, or we still have a veto power? It seems to me that if it's really hard to think of a system without veto power. In UN Security Council, because otherwise, I guess some of the states were not going to be on board. Now, the big question is, should we give veto power to India, to Brazil, to South Africa, to Indonesia, to Japan, and not to rethink? You could say yes, but then the list is very long of people that can block, and it becomes very ineffective. But a system with veto power is by definition very stable, a very strong inertia, because the one with current veto power are not going to be willing to have many other with veto power, so they just basically veto any proposal. Right? But that's the legacy of the end of World War II, where basically you had to have a compromise, or this is a system that was designed for the powers that won World War II. Soviet Union on one side, and then U.S., Great Britain, France on the others, right? And so that's the system that was designed, and it's very difficult to redesign. But I think the idea that some would have more power than some others, I don't see in the current situation how we could go beyond that. And so that does not necessarily mean that we have no hope for a rules-based system. Okay, you could have the use of veto power should be, you could say, okay, if there is a manifest violation of a rule, like Russia getting into Ukraine, you could say, well, okay, veto power is good, but then veto power means that a rule, a fundamental principle of international relation has been broken, and then inaction is due to the fact that somebody is using veto power. So in that case, there's a kind of incompatibility between rule-based and power politics. But in other case, veto can be simply used to say whether you want to pass a new law, a new rule. But once the new rule is in, the new rule is in. So I just, you could still keep a veto power system for legislation adoption, but not for legislation implementation. And the current problem in the UN Security Council is that it's really on implementation of existing principle and rules and norms that you have veto power, which makes it very problematic. But at the EU level, so in some issues, in some areas, then states can say out of very stringent national priority that they want to oppose a new legislation, and that's a different spirit than the fact once you have a legislation, okay, it's legislation, you have to accept it, or to try to really find some compensation. In that context, of course, and so several questions are looming with Trump behind, the shadow of Trump. Trump idea is Trump. What changes with Trump is this idea that you move away from a rules-based system to a deal-based system, right? So from a world in French, we make a difference between, in French, we use the same word for deal and agreement. Okay.
Para
So
referirnos a un
accord.
acuerdo y
Trump is really,
a
in
un
French would say deal
deal,
commercial.
¿no? En
It's like you
inglés.
go out and you do
Claro,
a deal. So I have a deal with you on the price of whatever I
yo puedo
buy,
tener un
but then
acuerdo
it's just a matter
contigo
of
sobre
deal.
el
You
precio al que
exchange
te voy a
tomorrow
vender.
Chose que je
whatsoever.
veux
And Trump
acheter.
is really,
Et Trump,
his view is very much shorter term,
sa
very
perspective
much
est
transactional, as we
beaucoup
say,
plus sur
and
le court
transaction
terme, plus transactionnel.
can be compatible with rule-based, but often it is not. Because the rules is more permanent, is more rigid, and so if you don't like the rule, you have to challenge it, let's say legally, or you have to try to have it change, and it may take a long time. A deal is that, okay, guy, I want to do business with you, let's just have a deal. And tomorrow I want a different deal, I'll do a different deal. And that is extremely problematic on all issues, in particular on issue of economic integration, because economic actors want to have some, let's say they won't be able to anticipate what the price of the product is going to be, what the income of selling a product, what's going to be the price to cross a border. And from that, you need rules. Deals when, today, Switzerland has 39% of, tariff when they enter, most of the goods enter the US. Maybe from next week on, because this is the agreement, they go to 15%. But, no guarantee what the tariff will be after Christmas. Well, it will depend if Trump wants to have a different deal or not. And that's really the specificity of the Trump administration, which I think the other countries are not in. On the China's part, China really, of course, they want to have the best term possible for them, but they are more into the rules-based system. I think most of the emerging countries want that, most of the European countries want that, and they still, okay, they try to influence the rules so that they fit their agenda best, but they're not really as transactional as the Trump administration has been. So that's interesting challenge here that comes from the Trump administration. And at least currently, maybe they want to revert to something else, but that's the design, the challenge. And that's the difference between the rule-based and the deal-based. And the fact that it's more, doesn't mean that it's namely better enforced, the rules-based system, but at least in the expectation of actors, you can have more long-term expectation. And this is really crucial for lots of movement of people and goods and services across the globe. Now there's questions that I've seen on okay, can we, when you design a governance mechanism, and as really saying, of course, the reason why you want to have a global governance is that it makes sense to centralize some deals. So again, is the easiest to explain is in trade. Do you really want to have 200 trade agreement with all the other members, countries in the world, or do you want to centralize it in one, or maybe one global and a few regional? And the argument is that centralization reduces transaction cost. Let's say you're a small or medium firm and you want to export, if it's centralized and people say the most favored nation tariff is 15%, you just have to look at the most favored tariffs in the WTO. But if you have 200 bilateral agreements, you have to open the 200 thing, meaning you need a lawyer, even in very small and medium firm. Right? Same thing for climate. If you really want to try to really address climate change, it makes sense to pool things, to centralize. So we see the functional, let's say, interest of centralization. The problem when you centralize, you give away autonomy. So if you have one tariff for the whole world, you can say, oh, US can say, Trump can say, I like Argentina better than Colombia. So I just want to give a better deal. Well, not if you have one global tariff, right? So this is the tension between centralization and willingness to have autonomy and to treat others differently. And after treating often other differently is just for politics. Right? It's politics, it's corruption, it's whatever, but it's politics. Economically, it makes relatively little sense because you can carve in some specific things. And that's the difficulty. Okay, if some people try to do this and to give favor to others, there's a bit of a mimic process, a bit of bandwagoning process where people start to say, oh, if you do that, I'll do that too. You're nicer to your friends, I'm nicer to my friends. But then in the end, nothing remains in the center and everyone is losing. And so this trade-off here is currently a difficult one. And nationalism, of course, tends to be against centralization, because nationalism says we can do whatever we want, whenever we want. And it is a short-term political, often, can driven aspect, and they don't care about, what's going to mean for the country 5 years from now. Okay. And so that is interesting tension. You can't have the cake and eat it. At some point, if you really want to centralize and minimize transaction costs, you have to give up autonomy. And I think for smaller states, it's almost obvious. For bigger states, they think they can afford the lack of centralization. And I think the figures economically tend to show that this is this is probably wrong, and this is very going to be costly. But you know, politics trumps everything in that domain. And so here there was one question on that, you know, how could you really make this balance between commitment to a centralized body, for instance, and still trying to search or preserve your national priorities. And I think the best example here is the European Union. So in European Union, as you've seen, you know, on many domains, you know, on Ukraine war, you know, trade issues. Some of you come from Mercosur country. You see the position of the EU on the Mercosur EU free trade agreement. There's lots of difference, you know, at least from a few countries. Some countries are very much in favor of that treaty that has been signed for you know almost a year now, and the second signature, by the way, or approved for 1 year. Or things, you know, environment, you know, kind of social issue, but so far they really trying to still keep this idea that, hey, we're stronger together. And I think to some extent what Trump administration is doing is probably helping from that perspective to say, hey, we're in between China and the US, or between China, US, and Soviet and Russia, we better be together. But of course, you know, there's a populist there, there's another populist there, there's a leftist up there, and say they have very different agenda. Okay, and so they kind of struggling to keep together. The critics of EU say it's not working, or we don't like that. But you know, the real question, the counterfactually, where would be Europe without the European Union? And I think the situation will probably be much worse. But that's my probably personal feeling. But I think I would say this is always this constant. How could we keep the boat, be on the same boat, but still say, okay, I don't like that type of meal, so I want to have a different meal on that boat. Yeah, you can do a bit of that, but if everyone is really eating completely different things, at some point, you no longer want to be on that boat. Now, a few other things are really the role of international institutions. Many of you are, I guess, interested by peace and wars issues. One of the things that I've seen, and particularly it picked up on a few specific countries, is this notion of, okay, let's say we have international governance, global governance, but how much can such an, you know, governance help solve very difficult and painful civil wars? Okay, and we have, unfortunately, many situations in the world that are extremely painful and extremely difficult to solve, okay, in most part of the world. Some are more or less salient. And yeah, we have to see that so far it has been very difficult for international institutions to help calm down this tension, or even and then solve them. And again, because the whole system is based on the national sovereignty of states. Right? So you can't have a system that the legitimacy of which is based on the fact that you voluntarily join this system, and please join the system because we'll be guaranteed your sovereignty. And at the same time, have the system that tells you, no, 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 we're going to tell you what you should do or not do. Okay. Because yeah, but you can tell me, well, but if they kill people, if human rights are abused, you know, states should not be doing that. Yeah, they should not be doing that. But but opening the door for intervention in country is opening a Pandora box. Right? Because have you seen in several countries, Libya is probably one of the best example, is that you'd be sure that there be many states that be happy to intervene, let's say, in Democratic Republic of Congo. Why? Because there's lots of resources that you can grab. Who wants to intervene in Sudan? Well, yes, some are because of gold also. But some, you know, then Myanmar, you know, I think you could see where they really want to go and why, if it's really they care about human rights, or they care about the fact and opportunity to grab resources. So we all wish international governance could do more to address some of the conflict, but there's a very fine or, you know, kind of narrow walking line that you could do, lane that you can do when you do that. And so in some region, for instance, in ASEAN, particularly some of you come from there, there's a very strong norm of non-intervention. You don't want to intervene. And of course, a good reason, because you have some states there or neighboring states that are way bigger than any of these ASEAN states. Okay, so, you know, I guess China could solve almost any of the issue of ASEAN country if they get in, but I don't think you want that to happen. Okay, it's not part of ASEAN, but they really don't want this type of things to happen. And then, of course, the price to pay is that there are many civil wars, or civil issue, or, you know, riots, or whatever kind of thing that are unsolved. But it is very difficult to really this notion of you know, kind of the state has the duty to protect its citizen, and if it does not do so, you can intervene, which was the basis of the intervention in Libya. But, you know, if you look 20 years now, almost, yeah, 20 years, even more, after the intervention in Libya, the whole Sahara is a mess. The whole, you know, kind of part of Western Africa is a kind of a mess. So the intervention in Libya, I'm not sure it helped much. Whatever we thought of the Gaddafi regime, simply just as this fact that you have the right to protect, or, you know, the duty to protect, you know, citizens. So very careful line to walk, I would say here, even though we all wish that they have more power to do so. Here, and to impose pre-pressure, but they try to impose pre-pressure to cut funding and so forth, but it's really slow action and maybe not fully determined. Not to say that many states have a lot of interest of having this conflict to go on, just to be very facing it. Turning a bit more to Geneva, to other issue, maybe kind of implementation, or, you know, other region. I saw a question on Switzerland, because you're going to come for your last module to Geneva. I think there was one question: why is it that Switzerland is such a small country that actually was not part of the UN for a long time, up to 2002, has so many, you know, international organizations? I think there's two, and then there's a related question of the difference between New York as head of a headquarter of the UN and Geneva, and maybe, of course, Nairobi too, if you want to add that, or Addis, or Vienna. But I think here there are two issues. First of all, there was already the League of Nations was in Geneva. Okay, so the predecessor of the UN was in Geneva. And so, of course, when it was there was already buildings, as pragmatic as that were, you know, ready for the UN. And they had already a kind of expertise of people living in Geneva that would be happy to stay there. So one reason of what you have after 45, a growing up, or, you know, a settlement of many international organizations in Geneva, is simply the fact that it's a continuation of what was before. Okay, it's, you know, it's the legacy of the past. The second reason, I think, it's really that Geneva was able to develop the technical, you know, it's really much more what they call the technical expertise. So it's really was able to leverage its neutrality, the fact that it's between blocks, it's not part of any blocks, and that here we do technical work. And so they're really able to capitalize on that, even though Switzerland was not formally member of most international organizations. There was really associated members or an observer, but I think it's that. So it's very much a kind of a network effect. So, you know, it's like in cluster effect, like in industrial bases, you have a few, you know, people that you subcontract that are around when you made, you know, I know, cars, and this cluster was already there. So you say, why would we like to recreate another cluster elsewhere? And so Switzerland has been able to really, and Geneva, I say more than Switzerland, of course, has been able to capitalize on that. So it's a bit of a, it's a long-term effect. It's a kind of effect that it happened to be there, and chosen head of quarters of the League of Nations just after World War I. Then I have several questions on to be more specific. I have a couple of questions on regional integration. So let me maybe, there is one question whether supranational governance or integration is good for global governance. Oh, then what is the effect on global governance? I think to some extent, you could have two answers. One answer is it's good because it's maybe reducing the number of countries. So if you think that you have, you know, more or less 200 countries, if they are really grouped in groups, particularly the smaller one, in the end, you have a mechanism to, it's a mechanism of representation. It's like if it's like, you know, when we have students or teaching assistants participate in meeting with faculty members, there's so many students, let's say 1,000 students at the institute, they can't all be there. So you have to be represented by groups. And so if you have these things already kind of integrated, I think it makes the transaction easier. Okay, whether Luxembourg or Malta feel represented by Germany or France is another issue in the EU, but at least, or, you know, in the EU, whether, you know, Lesotho things represented by Nigeria, okay, that's an issue we can discuss, but at least it's an idea that you would somehow have groups that speak for larger part of the world. So you could see it as a good way to manage from an efficient perspective and for even a legitimacy perspective. You can have a different answer to say, well, you know, it sets up a model of hierarchy, supranational. So because supranational means we have in the EU, you have the Court of Justice, which is, you know, but it's pretty powerful, can bind state to do things that they don't like. And that's a model that in many parts of the world, they don't want. I remember when I was way younger, I was writing paper trying to compare ASEAN or APEC and EU. And each time I went to a conference in Asia, I would say, ooh, no, never that. It's a bureaucracy on top of us. We want to remain completely autonomous, you know, national autonomy matter. So, and so by pushing this type of model, you could say it's again a conflict of different, you know, Europe maybe try to impose its model on the rest of the world, which at the current power status of Europe is not a good idea. And all its past history, which is, let's say, very highly problematic in many parts of the world. So you could say yes, good, you know, bad, you know, for some part of the world, if you think of Latin America, if you think of Africa, it could help to be more powerful if you're integrated. But if, of course, integration works. But let's say in Mercosur, you know, all the Latin Americans, American among you, there, but, you know, Argentina and Brazil don't really go along well. And if the two big guys in Mercosur don't go along well, then what's the point of trying to speak as Mercosur, which they almost never do, whatever they are. Okay, but this idea of having blocks, and I think Lukács, for instance, his dissertation is on this idea of southern, you know, common discourse, which is not supranational governance, but then the fact that you pull together your sources is really helpful. So I think that could be really helpful. Now, I think some of you have a question on Mercosur, okay, or Mercosul, whatever you're Portuguese speaking or Spanish speaking. And this fact of how much could you integrate, and the whole issue, I think here has been the specific question, but I do take it because it could be a matter of more power. If, you know, power, at least in economic integration, may also often link to the strength and the stability of your currency. If you have a very unstable currency, you always can left to the vagaries of, you know, the up and down in the stock market, and you're paying your debt repayments going up the roof. And so there's been a question of whether you should have one currency, El Sur in Mercosur. Now, again, here, look at European Union. So European Union move away from currencies, and you speak to German people, I can tell you they still regret the time where they have their own currency called the German mark at that time, but now they have the euro. The viability of such a common currency depends on how different the economies of the group are. Because when you have one currency, that means you have one interest rate for the whole group. Now, in interest rate, why do you want to use the interest rate up and down? If you have high inflation, you want to put up the interest rate. If you have, you know, kind of low inflation, slow growth, you may want basically to ease down the price of money and so on and so forth. But you have only one option. So let's imagine in Mercosur, Paraguay, Uruguay, you know, Bolivia now, you know, Argentina and Brazil on a very different business cycle. What do? You have only one option, up or down, or no change in the interest rate. And so if the economies are not somehow on a similar business cycle, this is not a viable project. Right? And that EU has faced with some part of the EU, like the Northern EU, doing better economically, but when some in the South, particularly Greece, Portugal, and Spain, were in a very big difficulty, what do? okay, you try to have transfers, you help them, but the interest rate is not, and so the credibility of the euro is suffering from that. Still, it's an okay thing, but if you just to compare between the Swiss franc and the euro, when euro was created, I think 1 euro was worth 1.7 Swiss franc. Now 1 euro is worth 0.9 Swiss franc. Okay, that's less than 20 years ago. So about 20 years ago. So I think, despite the fact that you have countries that are more or less on the similar business cycle, at least most of the time, it's very difficult. So imagine it in Latin America. I think currently it's non-viable. Just we could discuss, and in Africa, it's really hard to see where it would be viable. Well, in Asia, probably better, but I think there's no willingness to that to happen. There is lots of question on implementation. Okay, so we speak of summits, we speak of conference, we speak of agreements, but deep down, implementation. Let me pick one example. Most of your country you come from have signed and ratified many international labor organization conventions. Okay, in the ILO, as you know, you be a member, and then you have all these conventions about child labor, women labor, labor at night, freedom of association, collective bargaining. There's 189, I think, convention now. So, but your country can decide that I like, that I don't like, and you still be perfectly a member. But many countries have signed a lot of these things, particularly the main one. Is it the fact in your country, and I think it also includes Switzerland, by the way, if you think of Switzerland, are all the rules embedded in this convention been implemented? And the answer would be no. Okay, and what do you do? Well, there's no sanction mechanism. It's very rare that you could really sanction a country because, of course, let's say if a country kills its trade union representative, what do you do? You're going to say, oh, you kill you, I'm going to kill mine? That's not going to work. So in the end, implementation is left to the willingness to member states to do it. Of course, the others could say, please, I think it's better that you protect your labor, because then, these people are going to be more willing to invest their time in the company, blah, blah, blah. But it's really peer pressure. Sometimes you can use now with linking with trade or investment, but implementation in a system which is non-hierarchical remains up to the member states or is up to the bullying strategy of powerful states. So if US is unpleased with labor law in Guatemala or labor laws in Mexico, they're going to use whatever mechanism they can to twist the arm of Guatemala or Mexico, including closing the borders for 6 hours or 24 hours between Mexico and the US. But let's face it, I don't think the US administration cares much about most of labor laws in other countries. And so it's really up to member states. And, as long as this is not creating unfavorable trade condition whatsoever, as long as it doesn't seen as dumping, whether women working at night are well treated or not, I don't really think the US administration cares at all about that. Just be very frank. Okay. So it's really up to national government to do it. And so I think it's domestic civil society that has to push the government to say, okay, you signed this. We have to really work on that to happen. Okay? But deep down in the system, based on national sovereignty, it's up to the national sovereignty of states. Of course, there's signed agreement, but the mechanism to force them to buy those things are very soft. I think it's a lot of peer pressure. It may be technical assistance to show how you do it, but I think it takes a long time. And I think it's for all issues, except when, let's say if it is money politics and you get a loan for the IMF is going to tell you, look, you don't do that, we don't pay the next tranche of money, meaning you want help because you are in illiquid, you have a crisis of liquidity, you can't pay your debt. Okay, we'll make a loan to you, but we're only going to pay the loan in several slices. And first, we want to see what you're doing. But that's arm twisting. And it does not work in human rights as much as force, but you could really use power. And this is why the IMF and the World Bank have such a really negative perception in most of your country, because they're seen as, imposing, using power, your dependence on new resources, new reserve to basically kind of make things happen. So there, it may actually think. And so here's one question of the effectiveness of the IMF. You may not know, but the IMF has never, not a single country on this planet has dared not trying or trying not to pay back the IMF loan. Because they know if they don't pay back once, next time they go, nada. Okay? So, okay, but that's extreme dependency. So if a country is in extreme dependency on an international organization, this organization is going to use that leverage to say, okay, fine, you need me, but you're going to change the way you think. Okay, it's a bit like you say, you are yourself completely in, overrun by debt. You call your dad and your mom, and your dad and your mom, okay, I'm going to give you more money, but hey, you cut this spending, you cut that spending, otherwise we don't pay you. Okay, and that's, the mom and dad are normally much nicer than if you call up your banker. The bank will tell you, are you kidding? Or, you want what? Or yes, I give you money, but are your interest rates going 25% or 35% or 50% when I loan you? Okay. So this is where implementation can work, but it's implementation not in the smooth way that it should happen. It's implementation that leaves a lot of bitterness on the sides of those that have to follow the power to implement things. In the WTO, it's you don't respect your part of the deal, I don't respect my part of it. It's reciprocity. But of course, I just take the example of, you may have heard Switzerland and the EU. Switzerland has been, treated by the Trump administration in a pretty rude way. But by suddenly Trump deciding that the tariff that were at 2%, big in January 2025, are now at 39%. Because he thinks the Switzerland and the Swiss are cheating and whatsoever. They have a huge trade surplus with the US. But what can Switzerland do? So basically, Trump is going away from its obligation. It's really the tariff that they apply are really put in the books of WTO. He doesn't care about that. What can Switzerland do? Reciprocate? The Swiss imports of US goods is negligible. Not even, it's less 1% of whatsoever of US exports. So what? We impose 100%, crazy. So reciprocity does not work. Reciprocity works between big guys. If China says, okay, US, you hit me on the head, I hit you on the head. Okay, it works. Which it works, say, you impose me tariff, I restrict my export of rare earths. Okay. Oh, wait a minute, we're going to discuss. But, the Swiss, small of a country, Paraguay, whatever you come from, Myanmar, whatever, who cares? The US doesn't care at all. Okay, and so in that sense, reciprocity again here, implementation depends on force, whereas it should really kind of more be implemented by norms. So if it could be very effective, but it needs this kind of power politics twist. There were many questions linked to this notion of visibility and invisibility, which is, I think, a crucial one, links to the legitimate issue. So, and I think we've seen example. Okay, so people ask a lot of questions about how is it that Trump, succeeded in Gaza, what Trump is doing with Russia, all these things. So this is not the visible part. Is I say tragically comic when we see it in the White House, office, on the Oval Office. But I think most of the things are really invisible. That's bilateral. But at the multilateral level, the same thing. It's not the trade minister that meet at the COP right now in Belém, or that meet in Geneva for the WTO, they meet whatever in the world, that even if they stay there for 1 week or 2 weeks, this is not there that the meal is fully cooked. The meal is pre-cooked, sometimes more or less pre-cooked before that. And the meal then is somehow finalized or adjusted after the conference. And so if you have a balance between the visible and invisible, clearly the invisible dominates. Simply because, it's impossible to solve so many issues in 1 week or 2 weeks of a conference of the summit. Okay, so things have been to be prepared upstream, and things have to be finalized downstream. And that's I think the downstream is maybe less. It's often more visible, because if it's downstream, means it has to be ratified at home, but at some point of case, there's still kind of invisible dynamics between partners, business, social actors. It could be at the domestic level, but at some point it should become more visible, at least, if the ratification includes parliament, or like in Switzerland, like a system like Swiss system, it may include even citizens. So you could see more visibility here. But upstream, most of the time, is really invisible. There may be consultation processes, but I think it's really kind of it is something that is really hard to trace. Take, for instance, I'm often now, I'm a trade and investment specialist. I'm often asked questions by journalists about all these things about trade deals. Sometimes they call trade deals, sometimes they call trade agreement. But the Trump administration that they have now is, Japan, South Korea, Indonesia, EU, the Latin American, all the Western Hemisphere, including Argentina, Colombia. They have deal with Switzerland. They have deal, with many of these countries. I think it's up to 12 or 13, and they try to do more. But it's extremely hard to know how they came to this agreement and where they stand now. Because most of these things say, oh, we're going to negotiate to finalize this in the coming months. Are you really seeing lots of information and news wherever you look at on what's going on? No. So that's one example among others, that it's really invisible. And I think the more invisible, the more people are concerned. Right? Because it's okay, but what are they going to agree? Are we going to have to buy more, chlorine, whatever kind of chicken, chlorine grown chicken, or whatever, or hormone beef? People have all type of maybe wrong or good expectation, but this is the way it works. And it is invisible, because if it becomes visible, it's much more difficult to handle. Okay, everyone gets excited, everyone wants to have an input, everyone tries to really come to freak out because this is not going to happen. So you could see the reason why you keep invisible, but you'll see why invisibility creates problems. But if the question is, can we make things more visible for legitimate, we can. But I think it would be an illusion to think that things can happen if it's fully visible, because too many actors will get in, and then nothing is going to be possible. So I think invisibility is necessary. If you think mediation processes, peace processes, you can't have everything open, because people will not speak the same way. But at some point, you should have check of what's happening. And currently, it's hard to see the checks. Okay, when people are given, kind of take it or leave it kind of a situation. I think I've covered a lot of ground there. Well, maybe my last question, and then I'm happy to take a few more reaction to what I said, is this is the whole notion of how inclusive can global governance be. Okay, I think it's a recurrent concern and legitimate one for most of you, because most of you come from countries that have a hard time to be listened to in global governance mechanism. Here, I think a possible solution. So classical solution have been coalition is one. Okay, so you small, alone, you make coalitions. Okay, that's almost the most classical one. So okay, I'm still alone, but if we are 20 countries, 20 small countries make one big country. You say, hey, we should all do that. The problem is that it's very hard to have a common, strong, stable position the bigger the coalition. And if you're a small country, you need a big coalition. You can't only have 5 small states, because these 5 small states are going to say something, but hey, okay, if you put Luxembourg, Liechtenstein, Malta, Lesotho, Botswana, I don't know, small Asian countries, Pacific Island, who cares? Right? So you need bigger coalition. And often in bigger coalition, you start to have size difference within the coalition. So if you have a coalition in Latin American country, hey, Brazil is Brazil. You could do whatever you want at the Latin American continent. There is Brazil and the rest of the continent. Of course, the Argentina could say, we are as big as Brazil, we know the story, but the fact is, no. Okay, you do in Central Africa, but even in, kind of sub-Saharan Africa, Nigeria is Nigeria. South Africa is South Africa. So if you do a group of the AU, the African Union, hey, there's some people that are more power than that. So then the question is, how stable is the coalition? And if I am the US or Europe and I don't like the position, let's say, of Latin American country, of African country, of Southeast Asian country, I'm going to pick up on the differences and say, hey, I know you don't really like the Brazilian. I can help you bypass that. And so the coalition does not really. But I think naturally you would make a coalition. Now, interestingly, we would think of coalition not in the classical sense of states only, but you could do partnership with maybe NGO or business in the way that, you when you come to the table, you have this kind of different legitimacy. And this kind of public-private partnership, they somehow offer new opportunities, maybe to have some influence. Okay, that's really the way to think about it as coalition. The other way to deal with, so coalition is one, and another way, which is not incompatible with that, is really to develop an expertise, a knowledge on some of this issue of global governance, whatever it is, in specific domain, for instance, and to be respected for your knowledge and your expertise. So you could be a very small state, but with very qualified diplomats, and small state with qualified diplomats, for instance, in Jamaica or some country like that or Singapore, such a very small state, or sometimes Switzerland, they have, of course, Switzerland is a medium-sized states, but I think small states which with really good qualified expertise, they can say, look, I'm very small, but I can contribute as being somehow someone that could be a in-between person, a mediation. I have that knowledge. And so I think the smaller you are, I would say, in order to be included, the more qualified, the better trained you should be. So, let's face the way the US chooses its negotiator now, it's politics, my friends, how many money you contribute to my campaign is really, I think I can tell to the US ambassador in Switzerland, they have no clue of international politics. Okay, they really no clue. If you're a small country, you cannot afford that. Okay, so we need people like you, trained like you, and you have to engage in your foreign service, and then that makes a huge difference because you could participate. People are going to invite you because you know your stuff. And if you know your stuff, you can contribute to provide solutions and be included. But just if you say, hey, include me because I need to be included or I have a right to be included, yeah, it may help, but in the end, you need to prove why you will need to be included. And of course, in coalition, it can work, but you can do that, and even not being in coalition, because say, hey, I have this expertise, people respect my expertise, I am a reliable person, people can have trust in me, and so you could really do that at different level, which I think is probably a way to do it, and it's a way where, and then you could really work in the invisible, and you don't claim to be a big guy. You say, oh, well, let the big guys claim this is a victory, let Trump say it's a historic agreement, who cares? But you'll be there, and you'll be included before, and that's what matters as a way to do it. The more pragmatic way, and I think this is why it's really, really, as an American citizen, you could be a diplomat and not well trained, put it this way, because hey, you put the cash on the table. But for most of you come from countries that you can't do that. You have to be there, and people have to say they understand why you're here, because you know your stuff. Okay, we have 15 minutes left, and so Lukasz, I don't know if you've seen questions, that reactions or whatever. If you want people to intervene, it's a large group, I'm happy to take that or to go more on question. But I think I really covered quite a lot of ground. Not all questions I know, but at least given hints of things that can help answer you in the different question, even though I must say, oh, that was a very specific question I saw on what is my prediction on the Russia-Ukraine war. I'm not going to be wrong whatever answer, but I think it's in power politics. I think it's hard to imagine an end of the conflict if the Ukrainians don't make any concessions, but it's also hard to imagine that they're going to accept major concession because it's really loss of territory. And so we don't know what Trump is up to, but at some point we know his level of attention tends to diminish pretty sharply and quickly. And so at some point he's going to be fed up with that and let it go for a while. And then the balance of power clearly is in favor of Russia, simply of the size, and the willingness of and the fact that the regime cannot afford to lose it, put it this way. And so they'll go to the end. And so I'm not very optimistic of a good way to get out of Ukraine, unless Europe steps up. European new members, but the military preparedness of European country is not great, and I think the willingness of European citizens to really fight a war to defend Ukraine is, mixed at best.
Someone raised their hand. Yes, Tatevik. So, Professor, would you like to take questions from?
Sure.
All right. So, Tatevik, please unmute yourself and ask the question.
Thank you, Lucas. Thank you, Professor. Thank you for this type of interesting, comprehensive coverage on global governance. It was a truly pleasure to follow. Actually, I don't have a specific question, and I posed the question in the portal, which the professor just addressed. It was about inclusive multilateralism in the case of Armenia, because I represent Armenia. And again, I appreciate the answer, and I would like to a little bit comment and elaborate on that, taking again the case of Armenia and also all the other small countries representing that now our students, our DPP participants are representing in this webinar. I would like to bring a very specific example that Armenia witnessed years ago. It was 12 years ago, and Armenia has always been this country which was in between Russian-led alliances and EU-led alliances and the European Union more specifically. And in 2013, we were so close of signing the association agreement with the European Union. We had all these negotiation processes, and there was the summit upcoming in autumn that Armenia was already supposed to sign the deep and comprehensive free trade area agreement and the association agreement. But what happened? If the professor is nodding, maybe you remember what happened in during that period. Unexpectedly, we just woke up one morning in Armenia and learned that we are not going to sign the agreement because we are joining the Eurasian Economic Union, which is a Russian-led alliance. And this was a shock for the ones who were, the advocates for Armenia to join the EU-led alliances. And why I remember this. This is example when the professor was talking about the coalitions. Sometimes it's very hard for small states to really, be consistent and keep the track, and even the whole work that is being done, and you are very close to even have this, already official agreement signed, commitments, etc. And sometimes the huge powers, such as the big countries, and the professor also was mentioning how important it is. One vote is not the weight of one vote of small country and the big country is not the same. And Armenia has been the country who has been all the time, carrying these consequences of the big powers. So just a small example, but again, I really appreciate the answer, and the coalitions would work better, of course, if they are bigger and if the countries have the same interests. But sometimes again, maybe here as well, I can note even in the region when you are sharing borders with countries, and it is supposed that you must have, you know, like common priorities. Sometimes it's not the case, and this is I think that this we can project not only on Armenia but in other countries as well. But yeah, I will leave the floor for my colleagues to also contribute. Thank you.
Yeah, you know, I remember we had for a while a teaching program in Central Asia, and I happened to be in Yerevan not very far after that, and it was quite interesting discussion with a participant. But I think it's yeah, you know, coalition, big powers like to have people, you know, surrounding them and to being in the same coalition. And sometimes they let some small states join other coalitions, sometimes they don't. And particularly around Russia, Russia considers its neighborhood to be, to be its neighborhood. And there's lots of discussion about, you know, whether it should or not. But I think it's the same thing about Ukraine, about the Baltic states, and, you know, all these things that they invoked by President Putin as being, you know, unacceptable. But I think it's okay, they really value their national sovereignty way more than the national sovereignty of other states. And I think it's not limited to Russia. And US is doing currently, what is they doing now with Central America? They consider their own territory. What's happening in Central America should be really under the control of the US. It goes back to long tradition, and you guys in Latin America have bad memories of some of that. But I think the same stuff. So I think it's we could really put on Putin as different methods, but in fact, it's a bit the same thing. It probably would be hard also. I think China is probably slightly different, but whatever, China would surely not like to see a country like Kazakhstan to be too overtly Western and so on and so forth. So I think this notion here of coalition works, but of course it's much easier to do in a coalition when you're far away from the border of the big guy than if you're on the border, because they're going to think that may tilt the balance in favor of the other sides. And yes, in that situation, the smaller states simply have to take whatever the big one wants, unfortunately. Ala, I see a hand by Ala.
Yes, thank you very much for the opportunity. Thank you very much, Professor and Luca. Thank you very much for the opportunity. I'm really sorry that I missed. I've been trying to log in, but unfortunately, connectivity was quite very challenging. I just want, I will of course go back to the record and enjoy the very nice session. But for now, I would like just to maybe the very recent developments around Sudan crisis. Just yesterday, there has been this bilateral meeting between Saudi Arabia and Trump, where actually His Excellency Mohammed bin Salman asked Trump to intervene in Sudan case, and there has been some kind of declarations and statements from USA that Sudan now is going to be among the priorities of this, while it was not actually considered of the priorities. So I don't know, that actually was kind of quite, to me, to some extent, it was quite frustrating when you see how things are being managed in terms of global governance. Because after all, Sudan has been and was and still is the most the largest displacement crisis and the largest humanitarian crisis in the world. But unfortunately, due to this bilateral kind of relation, it was kind of bilateral, but of course it's going to have its implication on the multilaterals partners as well, the EU I'm talking, and the UN agencies. I'm sorry about the noise. I'm in a common place, so I would like just to explore with you, sir, how do you think we should have it analyzed in terms of global governance? Because I believe, is it the distribution of power and the finance, exactly who is going to finance the global governance is actually shaping the trend of the governance itself, and how it's going to impact the let's say the developing countries and those who are vulnerable to some extent with wars or conflicts or whatever. So I would like to listen from your side. How did you receive those news from global governance perspective? How did you analyze it? And thank you very much for the opportunity. I will make sure that I go to the record to enjoy the rest of the. Thank you very much. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Ala. I think I think what's happening is clearly shows that it's absolutely not working as a global governance. It's working as, you know, and Trump basically thinks he can solve by himself every single conflict. He wants to win the Nobel Peace Prize, but you know, and so. You know, and so why is it that Saudi Arabia is concerned? I guess Saudi Arabia is upset against the UAE, so and what they do. So you know, it's really, you know, I help you, my friends. It's really completely orthogonal to this notion of global governance based on a few norms. Okay, and of course you could say that Sudan, this never-ending, you know, horror in Sudan that's been going on for decades. Basically, you know, global governance is paralyzed, either because people don't care, say, oh, this is really far away from any kind of major interest, or we let it go because it pleases a few countries and we want these countries to be pleased. Or so basically the way now Trump would say, oh, you know, there's a problem, I'm going to seize it. I'm going to take care of it. This is not the way global governance. That should be treated at the UN Security Council. Then it should have an intervention from, or at the African Union level, by the way, it should also be there, but it's not work. But it doesn't work because you still have some outside interest power that don't want it to be solved. Put it this way, right? So I think if the whole world would like it to be solved, that would have been solved already. Same thing in many, you know, Central Africa, in Rwanda, DRC, thing, you know, never-ending story. You know, I think this is just probably the worst two spots in Africa. I think we can discuss, you know, Sudan, but because, you know, there's always some guys that is say, well, you know, they have some interest in it, that's so it continues. And so from that perspective, it's clearly global governance not working. Global governance or regional governance, like, you know, AU stuff. Okay, and the reason is because if, you know, it up to states, you need sufficient and strong support. And now if Trump decides to do it, they'll do it. They pressure UAE, they pressure whatever. It's not sure going to work because the situation, you know, it does not work in Afghanistan, by the way. So I think why would it work necessarily in Sudan? So I think from that perspective, it shows that. But global governance is still better than whatever we're going to see. So maybe Trump is going to solve Sudan. I have high doubt about it because whatever he said he has solved so far, he has solved it in declaration, but even in Gaza or between Pakistan and India or Pakistan and Afghanistan, or you name the list of conflict, or even Georgia or, you know, Armenia and Azerbaijan, we'll see, you know, to which extent these things are going to be implemented on the ground. But I think it's a different thing. It's you call, you know, Uncle Sam because they're going to solve it. But we know in the past that has not worked. Okay, at least it has worked in a particular way for some time, but then it has backfired because it has a very limited legitimacy. And it's tragic. Is should the fact that we should forget about global governance? No, we should not, but we should try to see how it can increase the pressure, the moral pressure on the states so that thing stops. But, you know, I'm sure you heard this notion of even people make fake story, you know, a fake movie on how these things were working in Darfur, you know, because of help of country X and country Y. So I think this is really kind of annoying at best, but really kind of very sad, I would say, from that perspective.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Right, there's a question in the chat. There's
Yeah.
someone with their hand up, but we have reached the end of the session. Do you think?
Let me just look at the chat then.
Yes. So there's a question from Sanu Dauda, and there
Yeah.
are now two people with their hands up.
Let me take one question in the chat because it's already 17. Yeah, so I just read it in the context of the Sahel and the emergence of the alliance of Sahel states. How can we understand the growing tendency of fragile states to challenge established regional and global governance frameworks? Does this reflect a structural shift toward a more fragmented and multipolar system of global governance?
Just a second. I'm sorry. The interpreters have to go now.
Okay. Well, okay. So I'll just do it in English, and of course, just 1 minute. So I start this question. I think it's
yeah, and well, thank you to the interpreters.
yeah. So those in Spanish speaking, French speaking, you'll have to go with the English version. So it's larger. So, but
Okay, they said
I
1
think
minute is
it's
okay. Yeah.
yeah. I think just to show that question. I know it's over time, but just I think existing established regional and global governance framework have problems, as I just discussed with Ala's question. And so you could see the perspective of those states to say, hey, it has not worked so far, so let's try something else. Okay, so you've been under the colony of France, kind of dominance of France forever. They try to establish regional governance mechanism under sponsorship of France or Western power. It does not work. So we never listen to our needs and so forth. And so they do something else. Whether what they're doing now is better, that's an open question. Because in the end, the states, if you make an alliance of states, you better have an alliance which is strong. And the alliance of states now, let's say Mali, Niger, whatever thing, it's anything but a strong alliance because the states are extremely fragile. And it's not by grouping fragility together that you make you more robust. Okay, and so, but the fact that they resent the current governance agreement, it's almost natural because they're not very happy with it. Okay, and so, but the idea would be to better replace or address or fix the problem of current governance system, being in ECOWAS or AU or kind of UN, rather than to try to step new alliances. Of course, going to be more fragmentation. But let's face it, to be very very cynical. The fact who I'm sure of course in DC, in Washington, very few people know of the Alliance of Sahel States, and if they know, they don't give a damn because there's no power. Or very little power. If they really want to make it unstable, to break it, it's very easy for them to send a few spy or a few things and give you a better deal and to make it split. Same thing, Russia could also break it whenever they want. So, but I think there's two questions. I think there is unhappiness with current order and people try other things. Whether what they try is better or not, that's an open question. In that case, I think I'm really not convinced it's the right solution, but on the other hand, I've not been in a position, so who I am to say this is not an optimal a way to go forward.
All right. Some of the people who had their hands up have asked the questions in the chat, but I'm recording the questions, and hopefully, we can perhaps treat them at the session next week.
Yeah.
But yeah. Yeah.
Okay, but
again
thank
to
you for
the
again
interpreters.
engaging discussion. Lots of well taken question. I keep them and try to cover. I know I'm sure you'll have a lot of them again next week, but if we have a bit of more time, we'll address that. In the meantime, have a good week and see you next week, same time, same day, I think, Luca.
Thank you.
Bye.